You've worked at the same company for 40 years, 4 decades, the same parking spot more or less, the same morning routine, the same coworkers who became something close to family, the same rhythm that quietly built the entire architecture of your adult life. And then, one ordinary Tuesday, you hand in your badge for the last time, and you walk out into a kind of silence you weren't prepared for. Not relief exactly, not sadness either, just quiet. The specific quiet that shows up when a structure that shaped 4 decades of your life simply stops. He tried easing into it, picked up some part-time work, just a few shifts a week, figuring it would soften the landing. But here's the thing he discovered almost immediately. Even a handful of shifts started to feel less like supplemental income and more like a tax on the only life he had left to actually live. So, at 62, he did something that makes a lot of financial planners wince on reflex. He filed for Social Security early, accepted a permanently smaller check for the rest of his life, and decided that his time, not his future balance sheet, was the asset he was no longer willing to spend. Look, if you're watching this and some part of you just nodded along, even if you're nowhere near 62 yet, I want you to keep watching because this story sits at the center of one of the most misunderstood decisions in all of personal finance. Today, we're going to break down exactly what claiming Social Security early actually costs you in hard numbers, why that cost isn't automatically a mistake, the one question almost nobody asks before they file that should absolutely stop them in their tracks if they're married, and how to figure out which version of this story is actually yours. Hello, I'm Anne. This video is for educational purposes only and does not constitute legal, tax, or financial advice. Let's start with a quote that I think captures this entire debate better than any spreadsheet could. A caller on a well-known personal finance podcast described his own version of this exact decision, and he framed it with a phrase that's stuck with me ever since. He said the value of a day of his life mattered to him far more than the value of some future, larger benefit check he might never live long enough to fully enjoy. Sit with that framing for a second, because it reframes the entire decision from a math problem into something closer to a philosophy question. What is a day of your healthy, capable life actually worth to you, in dollars, if you had to put a number on it? Now, here's where I need to slow down and make sure you actually understand the financial mechanics underneath that philosophy, because the dollar figures here are not small, and pretending otherwise would do you a disservice. If your full retirement age is 67, claiming Social Security at 62 instead permanently cuts your monthly benefit by roughly 30%. Permanently. Not temporarily reduced until some later adjustment kicks in. Permanently. Locked in the moment you file for the rest of your life, no matter how long that turns out to be. On a benefit that would have paid $2,000 a month at 67, filing 5 years early brings that check down closer to $1,400. That's about $600 a month walking out the door, or roughly $7,200 a year every single year for the rest of your life. And the math moves just as powerfully in the other direction if you wait. For every year you delay claiming past your full retirement age, all the way up to age 70, your benefit grows by roughly 8%. That same $2,000 benefit at 67 climbs to somewhere around $2,480 if you hold off until 70. And on top of whatever number you eventually lock in, annual cost of living adjustments stack on afterward. The most recent adjustment came in at 2.8%, applied equally to everyone, regardless of when they originally claimed. So here's the real tension at the center of this entire decision, and it comes down to something called the break-even age, which usually lands somewhere in your early 80s. If you live well past that age, waiting wins mathematically in total lifetime dollars collected. If your life ends up shorter than that, claiming early actually wins instead. And here's the wrinkle that I think deserves way more attention than it usually gets. If you're a married higher earner, claiming early doesn't just shrink your own check. It can permanently shrink the survivor benefit your spouse would eventually rely on if you pass away first. That detail alone has the power to flip this entire decision from personal preference into a choice that affects two people's financial security for the rest of both of their lives. Let's pause and tackle a myth here, because I guarantee it's exactly what a lot of you are thinking right now. Doesn't every financial expert say claiming early is basically always a mistake? That rule of thumb gets repeated so often it's practically become gospel, and here's the problem with it. It treats every retiree like an identical spreadsheet, with the same health, the same family history, the same income sources, and the same relationship to their own remaining time. But two people can run the exact same numbers and arrive at two completely different, equally rational answers, simply because one of them has a pension covering their basics and the other doesn't, or because one of them comes from a family where people routinely live into their late 90s and the other doesn't. The rule of thumb isn't wrong because the math is wrong. It's incomplete because it assumes everyone's life looks the same on the inputs that actually matter. Here's a thought experiment that might make this land a little harder. Imagine someone offered you a guaranteed extra $600 a month for the rest of your life, starting at 67 instead of 62. But the catch is, you have to spend those 5 years in between doing something you've grown to resent, something that drains you a little more each week. Framed that way, suddenly the decision doesn't sound like smart money versus dumb money anymore. It sounds like an actual trade between two real things: guaranteed future income on one side and 5 years of your one finite life on the other. Some people will look at that trade and happily take the extra years of work because the job doesn't drain them, or because the extra income genuinely changes their quality of life later. Other people will look at that exact same trade and conclude that no amount of future money is worth trading away years they're not guaranteed to get back. Neither person is being irrational. They're just weighing the same trade with a different set of values attached to each side of the scale. That's exactly the position the man in this story found himself in. And the reason his decision worked out as well as it did wasn't because he ignored the math. It's because he'd already done the unglamorous, boring work of making sure his pension and savings could absorb the smaller check before he ever let his feelings about quitting make the final call. The emotional reason to leave came first, chronologically, but the financial permission to actually act on that emotion came from the numbers underneath it. Okay, so now let's go back to the man who actually made this choice, because his story is exactly where the math stops being the only voice in the room. For him, two other pieces were already solidly in place before he ever filed. A small pension covered part of his monthly expenses. Decades of disciplined saving covered the rest. So when he claimed Social Security at the reduced amount, that check wasn't his lifeline. It was simply one more layer of income that kept him from having to draw hard on his investment portfolio during his early 60s, which happens to be exactly the period when something called sequence of returns risk does the most damage to a retirement account. Let's pause on that term because it's one of the most important, least understood concepts in all of retirement planning, and it deserves a clear metaphor. Imagine two retirees with the exact same average investment returns over a 20-year retirement, but the order those returns show up in is completely different. One of them hits a brutal market downturn in year 1 or 2 of retirement, right when they're also pulling money out to live on. The other hits that same downturn in year 18 or 19, after most of their spending years have already passed. Even with identical average returns over the full 20 years, the first retiree can run out of money decades earlier than the second, purely because of when the bad years happened relative to when they needed to withdraw cash. It's not about how the market performs on average. It's about the order the dice land in, combined with whether you're forced to sell investments into a falling market just to pay your bills. That smaller Social Security check, even reduced by 30%, buys this man protection from exactly that risk, because it covers part of his living expenses without requiring him to sell a single share of his portfolio during a downturn. And here's the quiet compounding benefit hiding inside that decision. Every dollar that Social Security covers right now is a dollar that gets to stay fully invested instead of being liquidated. That money keeps compounding in the background, available later for the things that tend to get expensive as you age: rising health costs, long-term care, or eventually supporting a surviving spouse who may need more financial cushion than either of you expected. But here's the case where this exact decision completely flips. And I want to be just as clear about this side, because the wrong takeaway from this video would be everyone should just claim early and prioritize their time. For someone who doesn't have that pension plus savings cushion already in place, someone for whom Social Security is genuinely the primary or even sole source of retirement income, that 8% annual growth from delaying becomes one of the best deals available anywhere in personal finance. Think about it. Where else can you find an inflation-adjusted, government-backed, essentially risk-free return of roughly 8% a year, guaranteed simply for waiting? Nowhere. Not in bonds, not in a high-yield savings account, not anywhere remotely comparable in terms of safety. For that person, spending down a modest pile of savings between 62 and 70, specifically to capture a permanently larger lifetime benefit, is very often the smarter move. And that's especially true for the higher earner in a marriage. Because remember, that benefit eventually becomes the survivor benefit their spouse may be living on entirely alone. So before anyone watching this signs that paperwork, there are exactly 2 questions I want you to sit with, because they're the questions that separate a well-considered decision from a decision you'll regret the moment circumstances change. The first is the survivor question. If you're married and you're the higher earner between the two of you, your claiming age effectively sets the financial floor your spouse may have to live on for the rest of their life, alone, after you're gone. This is, without question, the hardest piece of this decision to walk back once it's made. A smaller benefit locked in early doesn't just affect your own monthly check. It can follow your spouse through their entire widowhood at a stage of life when they may have far fewer options to adjust their income than they do today. The second is the cushion question. Whatever combination of pension, savings, and a reduced Social Security benefit you're counting on needs to cover not just your budget today, but a long, often unpredictable tail of rising medical costs and ongoing inflation, potentially for 20 or 30 more years. When those numbers genuinely work, with real room to spare, then time becomes something you're legitimately allowed to treat as a financial asset worth spending. When those numbers are tight or uncertain, treating your own time that way becomes a much riskier bet than it might feel like in the moment you're standing in line to hand in your badge. Here's the reveal I want to leave you with, because I think it's the part of this story that gets lost in most retirement planning content. There is no universally right answer here. The man who walked away at 62 wasn't reckless, and he wasn't making a math mistake. He was pricing his own remaining days clearly, with his eyes open, and deciding that a theoretical future raise wasn't worth the certain present cost of more years spent working instead of living. For someone else, someone without that pension cushion, or someone whose spouse is depending heavily on what will eventually become their survivor benefit, that exact same decision could quietly become the hardest financial mistake of their entire retirement. The details that look small and forgettable on paper, a pension amount, a savings balance, a spouse's age and health, are almost always the details that end up deciding which version of this story is actually yours. So let's turn all of this into something practical you can actually do, starting this week, regardless of how close you are to 62. First, if retirement is anywhere on your horizon, calculate your actual numbers instead of relying on a gut feeling. Find out what your benefit would be at 62, at your full retirement age, and at 70. The Social Security Administration's own website can generate these figures directly from your real earnings record. And seeing the real dollar gap between those ages tends to make this decision feel far less abstract than it does right now. Second, if you're married, run the survivor benefit scenario specifically, not just your own household income scenario. Ask directly, if the higher earner passes away first, what does the surviving spouse actually have to live on at every possible claiming age? This single calculation has the power to completely reorder your priorities once you see the real numbers in front of you. Third, honestly assess your own cushion, your pension if you have one, plus your actual savings, plus your reduced benefit if you claimed early, against a realistic, even slightly pessimistic estimate of your future healthcare costs and inflation over a multi-decade retirement. If there's genuine room to spare in that calculation, the case for treating your remaining time as a real asset gets significantly stronger. And fourth, if you do decide that early claiming is right for you, make sure it's a fully informed decision, rather than an emotional escape from a job you've grown tired of. There's a real difference between someone who's run their numbers, confirmed their cushion, and chosen to claim early with clear eyes, and someone who claims early purely out of exhaustion, without ever checking whether the math actually supports that choice. Both people might end up making the exact same decision, but only one of them is doing it with genuine confidence instead of crossed fingers. One more thing worth mentioning here, because it ties directly into how prepared anyone actually is for this decision in the first place. There's a well-documented pattern in retirement research. People who set up automatic recurring contributions to their savings, removing the monthly decision entirely instead of relying on willpower, consistently end up with meaningfully larger nest eggs than people who try to save manually, month by month. It has nothing to do with earning more or living on less. It's almost entirely about letting consistency do the heavy lifting instead of motivation, which famously runs out right when you need it most. The same principle that builds the cushion this man relied on at 62 is available to anyone willing to automate it years in advance. Here's my honest take, and I say this because I think most retirement content gets this exact issue wrong by treating it like a pure spreadsheet exercise. Money matters enormously here. I'm not walking that back for a second. But money was never the only variable in a human life, and pretending otherwise does a disservice to the very real, very legitimate value of time, health, and peace of mind. The goal isn't to find the correct universal answer for when to claim Social Security. The goal is to make sure that whichever answer you land on for your own life, you've actually looked at the real numbers, considered the people who depend on you, and chosen with clarity instead of drifting into a decision you never actually examined. So here's what I want you to do this week. Pull up your own Social Security estimates at 62, at full retirement age, and at 70, and actually look at the dollar gap between them. If you're married, run the survivor benefit version of that same calculation. And whatever you decide it on purpose, with your eyes open to both the dollars and the days, instead of letting either one quietly outvote the other without your permission. Because at the end of the day, a paycheck can always be replaced. The specific days of a specific life never can be. The trick isn't choosing one of those things over the other forever. It's knowing with real clarity exactly what each one is actually worth to you before you ever have to make the trade. If this video helped you think through a decision you've been putting off, share it with someone who's standing right at the edge of this exact choice. And if you want more honest breakdowns of the retirement decisions that get reduced to oversimplified rules of thumb when they actually deserve real nuance, make sure you're subscribed because there's plenty more of this conversation still ahead.